we're ready, we'll call the meeting to order. So. Call to order this meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, August 16th, 2022. So I'll stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll move on to roll call.
Chair Potowski.
Here.
For the last time. Oh, sorry. Vice Chair Hammond,
Here.
Secretary Stanberry, Commissioner Bobs, Commissioner Hicks.
Here.
Commissioner Cantor,
Here.
Commissioner Tamarelli.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a forum.
Okay, thank you. Move on to approval of the agenda. Are there any comments, questions, or suggested modifications? We'll entertain them at the time. Otherwise, we'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda as written.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda as written.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. The agenda is approved for this evening. So we'll move on to approval of the meeting minutes for the meeting of 7/26/2022.
Make a motion to approve the minutes of July 26th, 2022.
Second.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. The meeting minutes have been approved. We'll move on to public comment. An opportunity for members of the public to address the commission on any issues that are not part of the agenda for this evening.
There's nobody online.
Okay. So then we'll move on to old business and tabled items. And we'll start with generator placement standards.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Peach with Gibbles Webster, the Village Planning Consultant. And so we were tasked with putting together some analysis study of potentially amending or making amendments to the ordinance as it pertains to generator placements. So as you know, with recent activities, there's been some requests to place generators in the side yards. However, the ordinance restricts them to the rear yard. And so we did some exploration into the ordinance to try and determine where in the ordinance the amendment may be best fit. And simply put, if you refer to the memo in your packet, there's three items that stand out when we did the analysis, and that's noise, screening, and safety. And so just to kind of keep it simple and straightforward, if those three items were applied to consideration of rear yard placement versus side yard location, how would amending the ordinance to allow them in the side yard be impacted when considering those three criteria? So what are the driving forces that restrict generators to the rear yard? And like I said, we focused on those three criteria and put forth the recommendation that for the noise being the most important one, which would seem to restrict the generators to the rear yard. And so given their sensitivity towards that and the proximity to side yard adjacent properties, there's the potential to lower the dBA, the amount of noise that's generated from the generator or side yard location. So that may be up for discussion or consideration if that is something the commission wants to pursue. The screening standards, we feel that since generators are located in the rear yard as it is, only permitted in the rear yard, if there's a screening requirement, then it would seem to indicate that screening is for side yard or for properties that have views into the rear yard of an adjacent property and not necessarily the front yard, or where there's right of way, views from the rights of way. So we feel that there doesn't necessarily need to be much of a change unless you would consider enhancing landscape requirements or screening requirements for side yard locations, in addition to potentially having a lower noise emittance for the side yard location. And then the last standard to note would be the safety standard. The ordinance requires permitting for installing generators on a property. And so there's really no need to reduce that standard for side yard locations. So we propose, in summary, then that the setbacks essentially remain the same for side yard restrictions. And then the location within the ordinance would be to relocate the language for generator restrictions from 4.12 to 5.16.2H, which would be just a continuation of 5.16.2G. Where if you look at the amendments document that was created, the central air conditioning unit, the generator heat pump, since those are all similar mechanical uses, that we thought placing generator within that section would be most appropriate, and then to add a new section 5.16.2H with just some minimal revisions to that section, that being number 1I, the noise shall be limited to 70 dBA at the point of measurement for rear yard generators, which that standard would remain the same. And then the change would be 60 dBA for side yard generators. And then the second standard, that would remain the same. The third, this would also remain the same. That standard somewhat to some degree relates to noise, that being that the generator testing should only occur between 5 a.m. and 5 p.m. Monday through Saturday. And then, of course, the fourth standard, that being the safety standards for installing, going through proper permitting, would remain the same for side yard generators. And then to the last one, to the extent necessary for compliance with this section, walls and or enclosure and or landscaping to screen the power generator 365 days per year from adjacent properties and adjacent rights of way shall be necessary. And that's the portion of that statement that would be revised. That it's not just a screening, it's screening from views of adjacent properties or the rights of way. So with that, that opens it up for discussion. Happy to answer any questions or point in the right direction. Yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna
Okay.
ask a question. Sorry. to interrupt. I didn't know that there was a way to mitigate the noise on the generator. For one thing, and I don't know how that happens, and I would like to ask, how that happen? Is there something, a mechanism on the generator itself? And another thing too, is kind of twofold statement that, one thing that drove me to Lathrup Village in the first place with the different houses and the different kinds of houses, one next to each other, and the word cookie cutter, which then also causes a problem with the generator, as you've discussed. So the one question is, how do you mitigate the noise on a generator? And then, one thing for consideration is the different homes, they're not cookie cutter, so it's kind of hard to restrict them to the rear. Yeah.
So I think the basis of the research and the analysis that we did was essentially to determine, I think it's the 70 decibel standard is what the city has within the ordinance. And so our understanding is that with the advancement in technology, that generators are becoming more quiet or don't emit as much noise. And so if restricting them to the rear yard has been more appropriate for a machine or a system that emits 70 decibels, then if there is in fact the technology that that improves the noise emittance of generators, could that be a reason why you may consider amending the ordinance to allow a side yard location if in fact the product has a listing that it has less than 70 dBA, for example. And so my research indicates that there is technology that has that. What seems quite frequent is 60 dBA. But I don't claim to be an expert in generator technology, so this is all just a point of discussion with what the commission might consider.
Right, and related to that question, I have some other, related to decibels and how they're measured. Thinking that in the rear yard, may not be true for every condition, but in general, the rear yards have some depth to them in the location on the back of a house. It's further away from adjacent hard surfaces, or at least an adjacent property. Whereas if it's in the side yard and you have the opportunity for sound to reverberate off of, say, your neighbor's house, is there a concern with meeting the decimal rating, which kind of goes back, decibel rating, which goes back to the how are they measuring at the property line? Are they measuring? What's the standard for measuring the decibel rating for the purposes of the ordinance?
My understanding is the 70 dB measurement is the amount of noise that the system emits, and that can be measured either at the unit itself or at the property line. I think there is a section of the code that states that you're allowed a 10-foot deviation away from that, or it shall not exceed 10 decibels in addition to the 70 dBA. I'm not sure if I interpreted that correctly or not. But that's
Yeah, I
something
think
that-
there's an allowance for transient noise in the community. That was the 10 dBA. I saw that.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's talking about
10
ambient noise,
dB,
great. If the
yeah.
ambient noise is already louder than the generator.
Right.
Right, then the generator can deviate a little bit, like 10 dBAs above what the ambient noise. So that's like if you're living next to, I don't know, train track. Right,
They have a lot
some
of
business that's got a lot of like noise that it creates or something like that. Just because it's then hard to evaluate, how you differentiate the noise the generator is making away from the noise that other things around the property are making. But it doesn't, I don't think that's specific to, I don't think it's specific enough to address in a case where that isn't the case, where there isn't ambient noise that's already loud, right? So if you're in a quiet cul-de-sac, right, and you're above 65 dBA with your generator, is that a problem for all the neighbors around you? Versus like if you live next to an industrial building that's making a bunch of noise.
Yeah, and well, and my thought between the houses is, just gonna be a variation on whether it's occupied outdoor space based on individual property arrangements. So I don't know if there's a concern for every location. I just wondered if the noise value gets somehow the noise, the actual noise that's perceived in the space is produced or elevated because it's between hard surfaces. So I don't know how we would figure that out or dictate that. I guess we'd want to make sure that the decibel allowance is somehow not any more offensive at that lower level because it's between hard surfaces than being on the back of the house where it may not be. It may not reverberate, where there's an opportunity for other softer landscape surfaces and things that might dissipate the noise value.
Well, and that may be a reason then to have a landscaping as yours as screening. Preferred screening method to help, add some of those soft
which-
surfaces in there.
Which has the potential to mitigate it to some extent. I don't know how we,
How you
as a
evaluate.
commission evaluate that or.
Well, it's seasonal, right?
Yeah.
In summer, it may mitigate it, but if the leaves fall off the bushes in the winter,
It's not gonna do anything.
Right, well, in the same thing, in the winter, the windows are closed
yeah.
in
that's
your
true, too.
houses, so you don't have that issue or concern.
Right, but we
Um,
could require, like arborvitae's or something like that don't have leaves that fall off.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of hard to mitigate this with a blanket you know, other than to, you know, understand whether or not that value is gonna become a nuisance noise issue or not.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's why you stick to a number like 60 or
Right.
70, because then
Right.
it like, as long as it's not above whatever number we specify in the ordinance, then it's not gonna be an issue. But I think your point is really important that, well, that generator making noise and bouncing off the wall of the garage next to my house, all of a sudden creates more noise. We just have, I think we need some guidance on how would it be possible to measure if there's going to be some increase in the decibel level or the amount of noise that's generated if there's a structure within a certain amount of feet of the generator.
In general, with the houses with, if the garages are on the side. Or on one particular side and adjacent to living space, to me, they tend to be, at least I perceive them as they're quiet zones. I mean, there's a buffer to the adjacent house. So it's, you know, maybe less of an issue in
Right.
those circumstances, not to say that those circumstances are universal. It's a case by case basis. But if there is a situation where, for example, maybe the garages are opposite each other and a generator falls between two houses where you have windows, there's another issue other than sound. And I didn't see it addressed in analysis here. It may be addressed actually in the electrical code. And that's fuel source and exhaust, and whether there's any fumes issues related to, you know, are there any issues related to the placement of a generator on a side as it relates to a neighbor's open window or the potential for an open window?
Doesn't because I'm just thinking back to the variance request the last variance request we had, I think the ordinance doesn't say it's 5 feet from any window.
It's typically, in my conversations with the building official, that's typically actually the installation spec from the manufacturer, the generator manufacturer, that has to be 5 feet away from window openings, combustible, other
Intakes.
combustible
Right, so there's,
elements. So,
right,
um,
okay.
presumably that would only impact your house, not necessarily your neighbor's house.
Because it would clearly be more than 5 feet.
Be-
Right.
Right,
And if not, then probably not. then
just
yeah.
from as a point of discussion, I wanted to make sure that issue was at least aired. And I presume from a safety standpoint, and once again, a lot of those generators, I presume, are gonna be gas powered, as in natural gas, as opposed to other petroleum fuel.
Well, didn't this say that it was, maybe I'm mixing this up, but didn't this say that it was this is for permanent generators, right? Because a portable generator is a completely different story. right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're not dealing with a fuel tank per
Right.
se,
And a
Or-
two-stroke motor or.
right, or something that's gonna be right.
Another, I guess somewhat related question, because this was a surprise to me if I read the earlier day, the existing ordinance. So a central air conditioner can be on the side if it meets certain criteria, correct,
Yeah.
currently?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess the one thing to consider is, you know, the air conditioners, at least I did a little bit of looking at specs on various models and things like
You
that.
you
and
took
looking
it a
at some
step
articles.
further than me, because I
Yeah.
have, you're going down the same path, I think.
Yeah, and the air conditioners tend to be a little bit louder. So a couple decibels louder on average, it seems like, and that's an empirical analysis, so it seems like. I mean, initially I was thinking, well, no, we don't want generators on the side, but if we're letting air conditioners on the side, it's really no different. And they tend to be a little bit quieter, but.
Right, and I was wondering if we don't regulate decibel level for air conditioning
Right.
condensing units. I don't know whether there's any mechanical, you know, bias there. I mean, air conditioners are gonna run. I mean, they're going to be
Right.
much more frequently than a generator.
Right.
So it's interesting to hear the comment about the decibel level being slightly higher there.
Yeah, I think
Because
it even said pool equipment too.
Right, in the pool equipment,
Those tend to be louder than all of them.
right, which is an interesting thing
Yeah.
by itself. So,
Yeah.
but we're not talking about pool pumps and being on the side. But if condensing units can be on the side, I don't know what efforts have been made in the industry for noise related to condensing units. Don't specifically know if there's ever been a complaint about that. I think everybody maybe making a too broad of a statement, but I think everybody understands the desire to have a cool environment in a hot summer day than to worry about the noise, in which case, once again, your windows are closed unless you're, an outdoor person or you're outdoors and you are,
What,
it's just kind of something that exists.
what
It's a,
use allows the air conditioner to be on the side yard?
So it says,
What use?
Sorry.
or
what
which
use, what-
ordinance?
it says within a side yard, which is in excess of the required side yard setback. So if the house is further, if there's more space than the required setback, it could be located on the side yard. And then it also says if it gives you an extra 3 feet leeway if there's no residence next to you. So like my house next to the
Right.
open parking lot, I could move it 3 feet towards into the setback.
Okay.
I think that in general, these are much more common these days.
Yes,
And, we've seen many outages. And I think part of this has to be, the weighing of the accommodation of that. I
mhm,
mean, air conditioning wasn't that common 30 years ago. Now everybody has air conditioning. It
Right.
used to be people had open windows and air conditioners were allowed and people didn't like it. Now, we all kind of live with it. And
Yeah.
it is just a few days, if that, a year.
mhm.
And
Right, it's a
in many-
relatively low impact on,
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a pain if you're the guy next door, but on the other hand,
Right.
maybe you have a generator too, and you're not in the same situation.
I would agree that I think, I don't recall having heard of any neighbors complaining about somebody's condensing unit operating.
Right.
In other words, it's been a recognized and absorbed part of the environment, if you will.
but generally, like with the condensing unit, it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off, like it's cycles,
Right, it
right? The
does.
generator is gonna be running pretty regularly while there's an outage.
While there's
right?
an outage, so,
So it's a different
No,
level of
right.
annoyance.
yeah.
Right, it's the only thing running. Everything else is
I
fine.
think running outside, yeah, that,
Annoyance or resentment?
or is it, or do you
Envy.
become, or do your neighbors reach out to you? Yeah,
Yeah.
Hey, can I plug in? Here's my extension cord.
so,
But I think the point that you made, Bo, that it's relatively short impact, right? I mean, so you can be annoyed for a couple of days while DT is fixing power lines, and
mhm,
it's not the end of the world, right?
right, yeah,
I don't know,
I'm not raising anything as an objection, I'm
Yeah,
just,
no,
I'm just kind of somewhat questioning. Interesting how the sound, especially after Bruce commented on condensing units actually being slightly louder. Generators being a concern.
well, and
come out.
temporary generators, I mean,
Yeah.
those are way louder. And, how do we enforce that? I mean, is that just a call to the police and, hey, this guy has a generator that's,
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about before the meeting started. It's the noise ordinance, right?
When you're
I mean,
permitted to
those
make noise versus when you're not.
Can be a lot worse than
Allowed
the
motorcycle.
permanent ones. I had one at a previous house and it came on, you didn't know it was on. I mean, it was pretty quiet.
Mhm.
That's true.
I don't disagree that, obviously establishing a standard. Just drawing attention to that, I think somewhat maybe of an anomaly as to whether, air conditioning equipment was never a concern. And the generator.
Yeah.
Or
seems as though it should-
it's something that's receiving attention, so.
Only because condensers are allowed in side yards and generators aren't, right? I mean, if we already had language to allow a side yard
Right,
generator,
right.
then we wouldn't be talking about this right now. So.
Are there any, getting beyond, I guess, sound, one of the questions that occurred to me related to the positioning of, I would consider it any piece of mechanical equipment, but to focus on generators, it's its proximity to, its electrical cabling or wire in that wire's routing. I'm gonna make an assumption, and I didn't do research on this, but whether or not, the generator's got to be located pretty close to where the electrical service is. I think we would maybe want to have an opinion on whether or not you could place a generator and then, whether the code would allow them to run electrical wire on the outside of a, for a good distance on the outside of a house, and whether that's a.
Well, Les may know, because his is on the side of
an
the house. He
objection
got a
to
variance.
anybody.
They would, you can put the generator almost anywhere. What they'll do is they run the transfer spots to somewhere on the house.
Mhm,
Everything else is inside.
okay,
So if your power is in the front of the house, like my gas line is in the front of the house.
Yeah.
and my generator's on the side, all they did was take all the stuff in the ceiling, in the basement, and then they ran everything through the ceiling. It just happened at my panel box is right near where the transfer box is, but everything else had to be run.
right.
through the
Yeah,
ceiling.
I guess I'd put forth to the commission just whether there's anything that needs to be regulated relative to the routing of utilities from the piece of equipment and it not becoming an eyesore on the exterior of the structure of the house.
The only thing that's outside to the generator is the piping from the gas line
Mhm,
and the power. And the piping that goes to the transfer switch, which is all within the same 5 foot space.
mhm,
There's nothing that runs further than that. And
Right.
now, if you put the generator 29 feet in the backyard, then they're gonna run it under the ground probably.
which is what I would expect, yeah,
But when it's
obviously,
on when it's on the side or the front, I mean,
Right.
side or, and it's close to the house, it's only that 5 foot of pipe.
The-
It's two pipes, one pipe for gas and one that.
the,
runs
the,
electrical.
the aspect that I would prefer to avoid, because I'd see it as a, maybe a devaluing of the property, would be if conduit or piping had to be run and it's being run on the exterior, on the face of a house, as opposed to, trying to be obscured, whether it means going through the wall and routing on the inside, which in some cases is, probably maybe in many cases, that might be more expensive or could be more disruptive. But between that and running utilities all over the outside of your house, which I think is a negative aesthetic impact.
Yeah.
That goes beyond the homeowner itself and to the neighbors, depending on who's viewing it. Yeah, so that would be, I think, a consideration. I don't know if it's an issue, because I said the gas, there might be a restriction regarding it. Maybe there's a practical way. I mean, that the code allows for them to do something that's not aesthetically pleasing, but I think we'd want to avoid that. If we need to provide a limitation on or somehow stipulate that they're not permitted to run piping, wiring, great distances across the exterior of the facade, I think that's something of value, that I would recommend, trying to get some control over.
To answer Mr. Hicks's question, there are a few ways to soundproof a generator. They have a sound absorbing mat that you can place the generator on that absorbs some of the sound, depending on the brand of generator you buy. And then they've got, people put them on wooden pedestals instead of putting them on cement, so the wood can absorb the sounds. There's a full generator box. They say you can replace the muffler. And you can exhaust up the air as well as exhaust out. But if you look at the new generators, most of it is just the pad or how you mount it. Can't mount them on the grass. You have to mount them on a pad. Usually it's plastic or cement, it's your choice. But the generator, the AC, it says average AC units are around 72 to 82 decibels. The generator that I'm using as an example here is a 22K generator, which can run just about every house in Lake Village. And it's only $67.
Yeah, but what I found was looking at the most popular Generac line is at 66 decibels.
Yeah.
Is the 22K can run 2 houses. As opposed to just 1 out. And most, the average generator that they're gonna install is gonna be less than smaller.
Mhm.
And then the 22K is rated at 67, less than 10 is at 77.
You can also install acoustic panels, that's something I found, right? So you can actually surround the.
And I would
The
imagine,
issue that, cause we talked about that in the screening. The issue is that you can't surround the generator because of the exhaust that comes out one side.
Yeah, you don't want it all.
And as the guy said, you don't want to close it too much to the point that you can't do maintenance.
Do maintenance on it,
And
right?
they're very quick to say you want to just put year-round screening, which is usually some type of landscaping that is year-round. So most people just have like bushes, we call them junipers or.
Arborvitae.
arborvitae, yeah, year-round screening.
Yeah, it's all screening.
As opposed to like a structure, or like something solid that
And
would.
I've only seen 1 or 2 people put like we put on an air conditioning unit around the roof.
Yeah.
But it takes up so much space because you have to have so much space to allow for it to get out.
Vent and maintenance, like. there's
Well, the
some-
maintenance, I realize maintenance all on the top, but I think it's just the service guy wants to be able to. get
Ah,
it.
well, he's-
Uh,
Depending on the size of the service guy, he might need some extra
He
space.
might
so.
need some space, But the top flips open, but it is, they were concerned about themselves.
Right, and the ability to get air in for combustion, so it's not
Sure.
obstructed.
That's right.
Yeah, certainly in the, and the homeowners required to keep them clear
Yep.
from snow. Which would be, something that could potentially,
Accumulate.
accumulate or inhibit their performance in that. Under the right conditions.
Unfortunately, your generator only comes on when power goes out. It's not-
Yep.
And it only comes on once a week, normally, if you set it up right. Comes on once a week, runs for 6 minutes, then it cuts off. And I keep thinking,
So do we have anybody who's like hourly objecting to the idea of placing them on the side or an allowance for placing them on the side? I know Les is gonna say.
well, I mean, I think when Gifford looked at it, one of the big concerns was, is the lots, the way Lathrup is laid out. The picture in their memo, it's a square.
Yeah.
But Lathrup's not laid out in a square.
You
I
get-
mean, most of the houses are laid out in a square, so. Because of the unique shapes of the lot, I think you have to have some flexibility to allow for that. Shape of the lot, and then we have a lot of lots that don't have a lot of set, there's space behind them, but it's not there. So you don't wanna have somebody say, well, I can put it back there, but that's not my land back there.
Right.
It's
The adjacent property owner.
somebody else's
Also
land,
land, right?
or it's the right of way, or it's such and such.
Yeah, they have some sort of
So I think
restriction
I
or
think-
hardship.
The point was to allow for the flexibility based on the fact that, 1, they're more common, and 2, the lots are not universal square. And this screening it is probably, so that you don't see it, it's probably, the noise is less than my air conditioner. When my generator comes on and tests, I keep thinking it's the guy cutting the lawn.
But it's actually a generator.
I said, God, he's
Yeah.
back already, and then it cuts off in like 6 minutes, I was like, oh, that wasn't him. That was-
That's like the generator going through its test cycle.
Going through his test.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I was leaning against it, but then when I realized that it's so different than an air conditioner.
Yeah,
that's why I
like
was
less
brought
of an
the
issue,
question up.
right?
Yeah, and I guess now I'm wondering, so we've got this potential section 516.2.h. Do we have a similar section about air conditioners that's the same? Has a noise, a dBA limit and all that? Great question.
Not that I recall ever. seeing
Yeah, and I
that.
wonder what
You've got
kind
the
of,
section, 516 and that's.
Make-
That's the only
right.
mention of the air conditioner.
Right, because my thought is if we're not requiring it on air conditioners and we know that generators are a little bit quieter than air conditioners, why are we requiring it a dBA on generators? Or should we go the other way around and put a dBA on the section that deals with air conditioners?
and the good question is how do, if there's been this emphasis on reducing the noise from a generator. I don't know what efforts are made or have been made, or if, to what degree they can make improvements on a condensing unit for it to be a concern. I would guess that the city has not received any complaints on air conditioning condensing units. So it points to that anomaly once again of how one piece of equipment can be
Right.
maybe accepted, but one is receiving more scrutiny for noise, even though something else that's allowed makes more noise.
Right, which is why I
Which-
think maybe we gotta consider not putting a DBA limit on the two dot H.
Is there ever a situation where somebody might really, I can't imagine why somebody would want so much power that they'd get a unit that would make noise beyond,
Maybe they have a grow facility in their basement.
People and we keep shutting down for other reasons.
well, maybe,
Even the generator run that,
Right,
still only get 67.
right.
I was gonna
So it
say,
would be
right,
required to
yes,
then be in
right.
the rear yard.
yeah,
right.
is it a moot point, or do we as a safety factor just keep it in there and it,
I think you have to keep it in there.
yeah, my
And
tendency
they
is
add
that
it to
it's
the
an
air
odd,
and they add a clause in the air conditioning side too.
I would say we could do that if we understand that it doesn't somehow create some sort of hardship on getting air conditioning equipment replaced. I guess I don't know what the impact of that is.
The practical difficulty from it comes from an enforcement standpoint. I mean, we've had issues with motorcycles, and the level of decibels coming from a motorcycle. Our officers didn't have the equipment to test them, they just knew it was loud. And so when it came time, and this is years ago,
Are we talking about motors or radios and motors?
we're talking about motorcycles, just engine. We had an officer, he's no longer with the city, but he had a mission to eradicate every motorcycle that came down Southfield Road, so. You know, we had cases he wrote for loud excessive noise exhaust, but we had no way to quantify that. And,
Uh-huh.
you know, I don't know that, I don't think the city has a decibel meter. It sounds great at this point, talking about it and putting these limitations on. But from a practical enforcement standpoint, it's pretty difficult, and especially with a generator. Because when they are gonna be running and they're gonna appear to be louder because. The air
Yeah.
conditioners aren't gonna be running, the radios aren't gonna be playing, I mean, it's gonna be relatively quiet. I just see it as maybe an unnecessary, you can leave it in there, but an unnecessary thing to expand beyond.
Right, I think it opens a lot more difficulty to try to start expanding it to other.
Yeah, and this, and the generator. When we adopted this ordinance initially, I mean, it was, like Les said, people didn't have generators. 30 years ago, people didn't have air conditioning, so it was new technology and in an abundance of caution, I think we put the extra requirements and restrictions on it. And now that they're becoming more commonplace and the technology has improved.
And there's more costs available, I mean, cost effective to I guess have as an amenity.
We don't have to treat it as a strange creature.
Right. Yeah, exactly,
They're pretty routine.
I don't have any objections to maintaining it and maybe we just, yeah, I mean, we've kind of talked through issues related to it, but it's likely not something of great concern. And maybe it eventually is something that you could technically sunset, but I think it's probably safe to leave it in, would be my take on it at this point.
And is that discussion over just the side yard units or rear yard or both? Just to clarify.
Well, I guess the question I have is, because I heard some numbers being thrown around at like 66 decibels, and we're talking a limitation of 60 at a side yard. Do we have any hardship issues related to equipment to be concerned about? 60 plus 10? Okay,
Only,
Alright.
well, when the ambient noise is greater than 65 decibels, then you get the extra 10.
But we can't measure it anyway.
all they can go and do is make louder noise to allow the 10 to be okay.
Right,
Seems
Extra 10?
counterintuitive, doesn't it?
right, because now you're putting.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you.
Now you're putting issues that are gonna make it hard for people to pick a generator, and they're gonna have to know their ambient noise, and. Which is another, I guess, reason why maybe we ought to consider not putting the DBA limits in there.
I
I mean, I don't have a huge stake either way, but it just
Permanent
seems like it's,
generator's not gonna be put in there. But we were talking temporary.
Right.
They're much louder.
it just seems like we're opening up a headache here and making it more difficult for people to pick their generator and install them when it just doesn't sound like it's gonna be an issue.
if we feel like 70 can easily be met by the manufacturers, but 60 is a little borderline.
Maybe you just do 70 across the board.
Yeah.
Front
You
and
do
rear
70
and
across
side.
the board.
I did have a question about adding the word generator to the first paragraph of 516(2)(g).
Permanent generator.
Well, that's the thing. Should it just say generator, which then would also apply to temporary or portable generators, or should it specifically say permanent power generators, since that's the language we're moving?
Yeah,
Permanent.
absolutely.
I say
Permanent.
Yeah,
I would
So
say
just make it more
focus on
specific.
this permanent
Yes.
generators. And the expectation would be that if you have a temporary generator, it's not going to be running outside of noise ordinances or
Yeah.
hours of noise generation. Or not for any extended long period. If it-
yeah, then it's just the standard noise ordinance that you're dealing with, not.
But again, does that apply? Because I want to make sure that applies before we make a motion to approve this.
In looking at our noise ordinance, I think that's an issue that we'll probably be addressing at council, because there are some that probably needs to be readdressed in general noise ordinance. And I think we could probably encompass all of this as part of that.
And that's a general ordinance, so that's something council will take up.
Yeah.
On my list.
As far as action on this issue, we put forth a couple, I think, comments related to information. Did we undo one of them?
I think we agreed on the decibel rating should be 70 dBA across the board for both rear and side yards.
Any thought to, this is something that occurred to me earlier and I didn't speak it out loud yet, and that's whether there should be an emphasis on trying to maintain it or place it in the rear yard as a first pursuit, as opposed to automatically just allowing them in the side yard.
I like that idea. Like preference to install generators in rear yard. unless
Yeah,
it's-
I
because
don't-
like the issue that we had with the last person who was looking for a variance was it was a safety issue that was caused by their patio preventing the.
No. She was trying to claim it was a safety issue, but she could have located it 5 feet from any of her
Okay.
windows so that it wasn't, it was an issue of the hardship was self-inflicted. When she moved in, she put a patio and she didn't want to place her generator on the
On the
patio for
patio.
aesthetic reasons.
Right.
So she wanted to put it on the side.
Right.
Right, and I could see a situation where out of preference, somebody wanting to maintain their rear yard and not have a piece of equipment there, and therefore let's put it on the side and it's more convenient. I guess I didn't want to view put the ability to put it on the side yard as an out, as opposed to the ideal manner of it being concealed in the backyard.
Well, I guess I would say that the existing ordinance for air conditioners doesn't put a preference for them to be in the backyard, so I would say I don't think we need to put a preference in there.
Or do we have an inconsistency that's a
Right.
legal issue?
Well,
We're challenging Scott on it.
But the question mark is, all you're saying is you would want to put a preference that it's in the back. So.
Yeah, a preference is not legally binding.
The person
It's
says
not
generator.
my
and they say
preference.
It's not my preference.
Right.
It's just words on a piece of paper.
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to not say preference. I'm trying to say, do we stipulate,
Triage.
can you, stipulate criteria which says, if you can't comply with this for some reason, then it's acceptable to do this, other than it being, no, I just want this piece of equipment placed over here.
And then you just
Yeah.
bring it away from the second.
Right, because here are the
Yeah.
criteria.
Yeah, here are the
right?
criteria.
So I'm gonna make it so that
I'm gonna make
criteria
it
applies to
that-
me.
Right.
I don't know,
I kind of agree with you, Bert.
Yeah.
I would just not.
not go there. Okay. All right, well, for point of discussion, want to make sure we talk about all the issues here, so. Yeah, I went that way in my thoughts while going through this about, should the neighbor have a say?
No.
And that turns into a,
See, now,
that makes Susie's job really happy.
I'm just thinking in my head, she's just talking out.
Yeah.
loud.
Yeah, I was with you, Susie. I just mumbled it under my breath. I was like, no.
Meeting.
Yeah, I understand. So, and I came to that same conclusion. I said, that's just yeah, how do you control that? And that would be just another, yeah, we
I
don't
would
need
call it
another
that
board or
maker.
another committee or another administration to there's another task for the city to try to mitigate or address, so.
Are we changing the wording here to say permanent power?
permanent power generator, yes.
Permanent power
Um,
generator.
In the first paragraph of 5:16(2)(g,
We'll change all of those references, so it says permanent.
permanent power generator.
Permanent power
And
generator.
it's not a wind. No, we don't need to go there. Okay. So, do we have enough input here for language? Or you want to trust that the language will come back and we'll see a final draft
We can do that.
that we can then, view next
action
time
on.
and take action on?
So we need
It's
to,
probably the best way to do it.
we need to schedule a public hearing of the new ordinance language, Scott.
Yeah, so it would be or scheduling a public hearing for the planning commission and then a recommendation or transferring it up to.
To the city council. Yeah.
Do you want to wait until you see the revised? A second revision of this language before setting a public hearing, or are you confident that we're gonna give you?
Seems like the changes are pretty minimal.
They're
I
pretty
think we got enough to do.
I think we
do
can
a-
schedule a
I would think so, and I think if we want to stay on track with the items that are on. Later on in this, as far as trying to address these issues in a timely manner. I don't know if there's anything that would. Prohibit from the updated version and the public hearing not being at the same time. Or being in the same meeting.
Oh, one quick thing, I just had a thought, what about in the commercial district? Is this only in the residential district?
Yes.
Are there other regulations for in the commercial district on where you can place them?
We didn't look at commercial, I don't know.
Honestly, the only thing that springs to mind is, I know I've looked a lot recently at the Village Center District, and those requirements have everything rooftop screened, so
Okay,
I'm drawing a blank, to be honest with you.
it just popped into my head. And would a resident ever want to rooftop mount it?
I don't know if there's many residents. that
Let's see how many
prefer it.
flat top roof residents. do we
Yeah,
have?
not many.
There's not many that have that style.
Or would feel happy with a rigged platform on their sloped roof. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can't imagine.
I'm just asking a dumb question. maybe.
Yeah, and a structural
No,
permit.
it's not a dumb question. There are a couple
No,
residents
no, it's a
that-
good point,
Um,
but
I've actually, and I've, your point about the commercial district, I don't think I've ever had any commercial property come to me asking for it. So,
Well, restaurants, nowadays restaurants look for that, we're encouraging restaurants.
There's only ordinance does say in section 4. Number 2, power generators are allowed in all city districts as an accessory use and structure, anything to the contrary.
So if it's not excluded, it's allowed in all districts.
In all
So
So
in
is-
theory, you
so
could
it-
do a roof mounted. In theory.
so right now, this proposed amendment of adding amending section 5.16.2 G and adding 5.16.2 is really intended or is specifically intended to apply just to the residential district. And is that plainly stated? Which is,
well, in that first paragraph. G, it does say, it does say, located in the yard of. a
for residential properties, the
unit.
standard section, yep, okay,
Right.
okay. So this provides specific criteria for residential, but commercial if the issue should come up, there might need to be an ordinance for addressing it if we feel that there's some criteria, whether it's noise to adjacent properties, especially to the residential, I would think. And that's probably a separate issue, whether we need to look at generator limitations, restrictions, what's permitted for commercial, or maybe elaborate on that. If we don't have an issue now, do we need to be proactive about it and figure out what those limitations or what ordinance we would want to put together for that? So I guess I'd look to Giffords Webster to advise what other districts are doing. Noise, I worked in my profession, hospitals, which is a totally different, I mean, we're talking large scale facilities that and equipment that has been, diesel fueled, and noise issues are a concern. But in our community, I don't know that we have any businesses that necessarily would be using the level of power that are going to create, that level of a noise concern.
Right.
That said, if we're not, it's not something we've had to deal with. If there's an application for installing a generator, and maybe something that needs some guidance for, so that we don't have one being installed and then there being a problem
Sure.
or an objection. And I would think it would be between the commercial and the residential district
Sure.
as a primary concern, although I guess joining commercial might have some issues as well. So that's a separate, I think that could be looked at as a separate issue and doesn't need to be certainly tagged onto this, from my point of view.
Well, maybe we can add that to our discussion too, and a little bit about these so amendments and our priority,
Mhm.
right, add that to that chart.
Is it ready for a motion? I'll make a motion to add the term permanent power generator to section 5.16.2.g. And also add section 5.16.2.h as written, with the exception of replacing generator with the word power generator. Permanent power generator.
And then 70.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, yeah, and also modifying 5.16.2.h 1.1 to towards the 60 to 70. And I guess we said 70 everywhere, right? So in 1.2 to 70 as well.
Second.
And setting it for a public hearing on this,
Oh, yep,
September
setting
20th.
for a
public
public
hearing.
hearing on September 1.
I believe it's the 20th.
Third week of, no,
Yeah, it would be September 20th.
Yeah,
Yeah.
setting a public hearing on September 20th.
Second.
those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Hi,
Opposed? Hearing none. Motion is passed. We'll move on to the topic of impervious surface coverage standards.
We were talking about that last one. Yeah.
Let's start on item on page 10.
Yeah. Page 10. There's only a brief update, really. And I'm actually gonna let Eric take over and lead us through the definitions and what they need us to do.
Yeah, so first and foremost, we want to thank you for taking, well, survey was the other project, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself. But what we did was, we did an analysis of using our mapping material equipment, just doing an analysis of certain number of properties within the community, Just to try and gauge and understand what type of impervious coverage may be common within the community on individual lots. And so what we found is that roughly 35% came out to be the average. And so that's kind of the number that we are focused on right now, since there's no language within the ordinance that talks about impervious coverage. And so having said that, I don't know if you had a chance to look over the memo for this section. It talks about the surrounding communities and just kind of gives a comparison. The one that kind of stands out is the Oak Park allowances that are quite high for impervious coverage. But it just kind of gives you an idea of how to gauge what might be appropriate for Lathrup Village.
You're saying open park with a more restrictive in terms of the allowance for impermeable. So they have maximum impervious surfaces 50%. They have, yeah, they've got it quite, I mean, defined based on the different residential districts.
Right. So in considering what might be most appropriate for Lathrup Village, there's a blanket percentage that you could apply for the properties. However, it doesn't really take into consideration the fact that some lots are larger, some lots are smaller, some lots aren't as cutthroat in the sense that they're not, perfect rectangles, and so that may impact where coverage could go on a lot, and potentially be more lenient towards the smaller lots, just because there's not as much area to develop. And then the last piece of information would be that it's potentially possible for setting a standard of impervious coverage and then having a allowance for additional consideration for bioswales. So things like rain gardens and permeable pavement. And then the last example given is the green roofs. So these types of things that might be able to help ease the impact of impermeable surfaces. So with that said, we can open the floor for discussion on what we discussed in the past, the current report. Happy to answer questions.
The commission has any thoughts regarding this? I know I have some myself, but
Well, I actually posted something on Village's page on Facebook, just making people aware that this meeting was happening and this issue was going to be covered. And the major comment back was to consider exactly what Eric just said about the range of coverage sizes depending on the lot size, right? Because the smaller lot is just necessarily going to be covered more by structures and impervious surfaces. A higher percentage of a smaller lot will be covered just to make it functional.
right.
Whereas if you have a really large lot, then, you can have a lot more flexibility in terms of, a lower percentage of coverage, but still be functional. Right? So,
Right. I didn't want to, that was one of the things that concerned me regarding this is that certainly larger lots have more potential to balance out the impermeable surface that might be created.
Right.
More open land, more space that's not necessarily a hard surface, which I presume would include like patios, but maybe not decks. Don't know where decks necessarily come in. I assume that they're like, while they drain, they're not
they usually don't have
maybe
cement under there.
contributing to the same level of runoff.
I'm gonna assume if this is considered pervious, then a deck is gonna be pervious.
Right, exactly. That was my take on it as well. But I didn't want to see a smaller property, which might be a lower income, have, undue restrictions on their ability to enjoy their outdoor space. And if that means, they can't have a patio or it somehow has a limitation. How do we want to do this sensitively without putting an undue restriction on a smaller lot property owner? and I guess I don't know exactly what the best way to go about that is unless you start creating, you know, started thinking about this as you instead of having a hard surface, do you, yeah, put down, you know, a deck or something that, or maybe it's even loose gravel as a soft surface that, you know, once again, it starts to get into restricting possibilities for what somebody might want to do in their yard. I look at it a little differently, I think, maybe a little more sensitively from that standpoint versus, do I want to park more vehicles? Or, you know, have more driveway space, which is a concern, I think, both visually and as well as the runoff situation that it can create for the community. So I mean, that gets into the aesthetic issue as well as the infrastructure issue. So yeah, how to crack this nut as far as what's the best way to regulate it in a sensitive manner, given the variation in lot sizes. And
And you could just say, you know, we've got a lot size of 10,000 square feet or. But, you know, give
Yeah,
that range,
range.
give that range, you know, if it's between, you know. 0 and 10, then you get, you know, I
yeah,
don't know what.
a greater,
reasonable- yeah,
a
you know,
greater percentage that's allowed to
and
be
if you're
impermeable.
Yeah, if you're
Scale
15 feet, yeah, do a sliding scale on it.
Right, and a sliding scale may make sense.
Especially with our
How we
lot.
decide exactly what that is
If,
and get
if,
context for it.
looking at the samples of municipalities, it looks like the average, except for Oak Park, is 25 to 35%. Does that then, if they put in processes or devices like the bio retention pond, does that then increase their, you know, their impervious surfaces? Do they get an opportunity to do that? Does that mitigate that if they put in those measures?
Yeah, so it gets
And how do you
much
measure
it?
5%.
How much of an impact is installing like a bio retention or?
One rain
roof?
barrel, does that get me a whole new driveway or?
Right,
You know,
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and
General standard form, like
that's a good
formula for that,
a
like.
good point, because I actually, we went the rain barrel route at my house for a short time. And I say for a short time because I thought, you know, thinking practically about it and wanting to use water, I created an elevated stand and put a rain barrel on top and promptly cracked and it was a heavy duty rain barrel, heavy duty plastic, and it still cracked the bottom because I didn't have support underneath fully. But and I jotted down notes here, I have like a 16 by 20 family room and a low slope roof. And an average rainstorm, I could have filled 3 or 4 rain barrels of, you know, 35, 40 gallon, you know, size estimated. And so it gets into if you allow rain barrels, and then how practically are they being used? So you just need to make sure they're yeah, you don't want to get into regulating how that they're functioning.
Well, that's my other
Yeah.
concern with this is because we have had commercial properties attempt to use permeable paving
Right, that was gonna
solutions,
be my comment.
and it's been a disaster.
Right.
To put it nicely, I mean, installation.
Maintenance.
Standard, I mean, I think it's gonna require more than just a percentage. I mean, you're gonna have to dive in terms of standards and what the expectations are for implementation, so that you're not stuck with a bunch of, you know, non-functional permeable pavements.
Right, and permeable pavements, yeah, break up. I've seen that in Carpenter Lake.
Well, and they don't, this one in particular, it doesn't drain, it was installed improperly, the base underneath was not taken out and removed with appropriate material that'll drain, so.
Right.
You know, my recommendation would be, if it is something that you're interested in moving forward with, then it needs to be pretty comprehensive. We need to have standards, and we need to make sure that we're not stuck with situations. And it probably would be more applicable for the commercial district, because that's where most of your paving is, and just in my mind, in parking lots, things like that. That's where you're gonna see your biggest impact versus, you know, maybe a residential lot that is a quarter acre in size, and how much is that really gonna translate into, recharging the the water table, so to speak,
Right, right.
versus a larger piece that may have, you may gain more function from that.
In my experiences, if any of the areas that my introduction in my career to permeable surfaces were for pavements for emergency vehicle access on facilities where they needed to get utility or fire trucks and emergency equipment over around to, green spaces where they're not getting heavy use, they're not getting, so there's an opportunity for some of those products to
Yeah, well,
perform more like they're intended.
we look out the window,
Yeah.
and you can see what I'm referencing.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And
They intended to drive large vehicles on this, and it just, it
Yeah.
hasn't worked.
right, and it's never become, I mean, it may be permeable, but it wasn't green. If it's souded, you're gonna have grass growing up through it, it's gonna become a dense surface underneath your lawns. I haven't seen a lot of success when those are really being used for traffic on a frequent basis.
Yeah, and I would take that a step further and say, the same is true for the rain gardens. If you ask your business partner and our city engineer, he would say, no way, don't allow the rain gardens, but a lot of them have been done improperly. The city was promoting these, a decade ago, and a lot of people did them and they didn't follow the appropriate appropriate procedures to create one that actually drains appropriately. And what you have now throughout the city is these, blocks in the ditches that are causing the ditches to not function properly.
And that's a lack of standards, when we
Right.
were
Oh, not
promoting the rain gardens, we didn't, also promote the way to.
And I have the same concern about like things like green roofs, right? So like, cause green roofs are expensive to maintain, like they take ongoing maintenance, and if you're not.
We got lots of green roofs. I see tickets for moss and mold.
Yeah,
Intentional green roofs, I think is what I.
Yes.
Yeah.
Individual, they may say. it was
Something other than
intentional.
the gutter.
right. There's yeah. I've got notes on that as well. I don't feel that the average homeowner is ready to take on the level of maintenance that they would require on a slope roof.
Mowing them has gotta just be a pain.
Oh, yeah.
Forget about mowing them, just keeping them alive so that they look decent and they
Right.
don't become an eyesore, or they collect debris and cause your roof to
Right.
decay.
Right.
So those are valid concerns.
The Amazon drone lawnmower.
With
comes
with
in-
with it,
Really goes. Come on.
Really goes.
Yeah. yeah, I think there's an opportunity for like flat roof,
Maybe.
done well,
Maybe.
but I don't know that there's a
So-
crying demand for those being placed on our slope roof.
So to cut to the chase, it feels to me like what we're saying is that like all these potential ideas to kind of mitigate the impact of impervious surfaces by providing other mechanisms for people to kind of gain points by putting pervious surfaces in aren't really a good idea. Like we shouldn't be allowing people to put in more cement and in exchange trying to put in pervious surfaces to try and mitigate the impact of putting in more cement. Because none of these ideas sound like good ideas.
Well,
Pavers, roofs,
I
like
think
rain garden.
I think a swale or the, bioswales or things like that, but are they going to be done correctly?
Well, there's
And
gotta
then
be
are-
standards.
And
like
then are
Scott
they
said,
gonna
yeah.
be maintained correctly?
Right, and it's also maintenance, because you don't maintain them over time, they just.
Which,
So, and even if we set a standard, like who's is code enforcement gonna be capable of actually enforcing that standard?
or,
Like, I'm
or,
not sure.
or is it gonna become a criteria for, you're gonna have to have, like Gibbles Webster, for an example, send out their engineers and do flow rate testing.
Once a year. or every
To
couple years.
make sure that they're operating. Before you offer that as an option, I guess you would wanna know that what can somebody, couple of things here, before you go down that route. Do you have a space to incorporate them in your yard? And is it something somebody's willing to take on? Cause I see these more in commercial developments where there's opportunities to incorporate them in islands amongst parking lots and things like that. I'm not sure how extensively they could be practically applied on many of the lots. In some larger areas, they may work, but do they need them? or, you know, is it gonna be a driver from that perspective, other than saying I've got a backyard pond and we can flow water into it, which is, might have its own concerns associated with it, or.
It sounds like we're potentially opening a can of worms. That's the way I'm feeling about it.
I have a couple comments. One is, I think is fairly simple. The other might be trying to boil the ocean, but I still think it might be necessary. The first one is the problem not impervious surfaces and runoffs in residences, but rather the amount of cement and parking and the use of gravel as a parking pad in front of the house? Is that more the issue? I mean, we've all seen houses where there's 6 cars parked on cement, on crushed gravel, and to me, that's more the issue. Yeah, there's an issue with runoff, but it's more of a neighborhood beautification issue to me, or you know,
Combined with infrastructure, I think, to a degree, but I agree with you on that front.
you
That,
know, I'm not turning my back to the runoff issue, which is to me frankly a much bigger issue. That maybe it's the infrastructure group, maybe it's the council. I mean, our single largest budget item in the city is water and sewage. And I would bet that there's no one in this room that can tell me exactly why we pay 3%, 3.06% of the costs of the Farmington Evergreen Drain District. What's the calculation based on? And why is our rate as a city compared to other cities that are the same size or slightly bigger, you know, 5, 6, 10 times more than a city of a similar size? And the same thing if you look at it from a population perspective. I think, I don't know if it's this group's domain, if it's the administration needs to look at this, but you know, we've spent a lot of money and I think we've done a lot of good things to hopefully control runoff and prevent runoff from getting in the sewage, and yet our sewage rates remain incredibly high. We want to try and reduce runoff. How can we do that? And I think the start of that is to understand why we pay so much. I don't know. I mean, we want to do these things to prevent runoff. Well, where's the benefit at the end of the tunnel?
Right, if we're still
Mhm.
paying a higher
You know,
percentage.
which
even if
is-
Well,
we're-
how do we incent our residents to cut off their drains or the connections to the
Downspouts.
sewer down below, you know, in their front yards? What, I mean, those kind, you know, what are the things that we do that will improve our runoff, reduce our costs as a resident for paying for sewage? I don't know. I talked to somebody at the Water Resources Commission and they had more 3- and 4-letter acronyms in the space of 20 minutes trying to tell me. I don't think they really wanted me to understand how the sewage rate was calculated. And I think you look at some basic numbers and it's kind of startling. And I don't know if any of us have ever looked at that. I mean, we signed something back in August that we agreed to pay 3% of all the charges in the Evergreen Farmington district, and I would bet there's no one here that could tell us why we pay 3%. Birmingham pays, you know, 1%, 2%, whatever it is. Now, that's a much bigger
Yeah, it
question
would
if we
be
want to address runoff.
From
I
the,
mean,
from the standpoint of, yeah, if we could define that it's related to permeable surface versus impermeable, you know, do we have a greater percentage of permeable or impermeable surface between our houses and our pavement contributing to that? Sounds like another, just like a side investigation that
Yeah, I
should
mean,
be conducted.
I agree. I mean, those are great questions that Bo brings up. I mean, they've deserved to get researched and answered. That's not the purview of the planning commission.
Correct.
I sense administration and council is the answer to. And, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I sense those are the, at least the beginning of the answer.
So, okay,
But,
Finish your
so I think that, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, right, yes, we don't know the answers to those questions. But I still think that there are, I still think it's a worthwhile endeavor to limit and mitigate whatever runoff we have.
So we don't overrun our stormwater retention tanks and things like that.
So we don't overrun those, so we are So we are maintaining the good things that we've already done, you know, I mean, just taking
No
care of the
codes.
systems that we're putting in place.
Yeah.
And just very simply, it can't hurt. I don't see how it can hurt. Right? I mean,
But I think, Bo brought up a point that I think what you were trying to say was like, well, if you have like cement slabs in your backyard for a gazebo or a shed or something like that, if you have that same size cement and it's closer to the street, that's gonna have a bigger impact on stormwater runoff, right?
Yeah.
So the
Yeah,
location of where the impervious surface also has.
Where, or how it
impact.
drains, essentially to where it's.
Where
draining.
the drain, exactly.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. So we could say, should there be a regulation of impervious surface in the front yard, front side yard?
Anywhere, yeah, where it can go to a driveway
Yeah,
or to a sidewalk. or to the
Anywhere, I
street.
guess, if you want to say in the basin that runs to the drainage system, which I suppose ideally in all our yards, it all drains back out to the front, but we know that's not the case.
No,
Yeah,
because we have
Yeah.
many neighbors who have swamped backyards.
right, right. Yeah.
so again, mitigating stormwater can't.
Yeah.
Right?
Mitigating stormwater. Right. And I think it also contributes to the appearance issue in terms of, as much as I have many cars in my driveway and I have a driveway that can hold 4 cars probably safely, do we want to be promoting multiple? And I know we have some exception issues in, I think, in the community, because we do have some homes that are, I think, designated for occupancies that have more vehicles. I don't know if they're directly related to that. I know there's, I mean, I've observed some situations where formerly grass areas are covered with like gravel or
Or
so
asphalt.
that additional vehicles can be parked. I mean, I'm raising the issue of like, what I understand to be, like group homes or care, homes that are accommodating multiple adults who have the ability to drive. And so there are multiple vehicles in those locations. So I don't know how that's been addressed in the past. I know in the past, the community has restrictions on being able to park vehicles on unpaved surfaces, and also that those vehicles need to be operational and not, storage.
Not disabled or.
And I don't believe any of those have those restrictions or limitations have changed since I've been in the community, or have been lightened to, to allow more. But I have seen throughout my time that more and more pavement being put in the front yards to accommodate vehicles and proximity to homes access. It might be a convenience of access. So there's that aspect of it too. Do we have an accessibility where a homeowner wants to reduce their walk because they're just not physically able to make it up into their house? And I know that gets into a different issue, which is accessibility to individual properties. But is it necessary to have a drive added in front? Do we need to look at restricting, how much pavement you can put in your front yard?
Talking about things like circle drives.
Circle
that come
drives.
closer to your front door. things
Right,
like that.
right, things like that.
But some of this is related to what I brought up last night, about the encroachments and the fact that, we've got people who are putting concrete in the right of way, and the question for, it's kind of tied into what I asked for last night for that conversation to, happen among the administration and council is, do we want to continue to allow that?
Well, because we don't have a standard
Right.
for it either,
Right.
so I have a lot of thoughts about all of that. and
Yeah,
it's-
I know you
mean,
do.
they're not linear, so
Right.
I don't.
Right,
I'm not
we've had this
projecting all of it
conversation, so.
To the scattered shot of my thoughts on that, but I mean, we have zero standards for how we regulate extra slightly off-street parking, right? That's essentially what it is, slightly off.
So, yeah.
Shoulder parking,
I mean,
right-of-way parking, however you want to term it, right?
whether it's a Yeah, I
whether
don't,
it's gravel, gravel, asphalt, concrete,
pavement, yeah. the
Dirt.
pavements, Yeah,
grass, permeable, there's nothing. So, that's certainly an issue.
That to me is a bigger question than the runoff, quite frankly.
And then, we run into issues like we've been running into with the road project where, somebody's got a concrete in the right of way or asphalt in the right of way, and we're putting the new road in and they want us to replace
Yeah,
or repair the right of way.
right.
Or people who put it in without a permit.
so, right.
It would be interesting to know too, what percentage of all the impervious surface in the city is roadway, is parking lot, is commercial, is residential. If residential impervious total is 15%, and roads are 30%, and commercial parking lots are 30%, and commercial buildings are 20%. Does it make sense to focus our energies on 15% when you've got 85% other that might be better to spend the time?
It's a good point, but one thing that was noted in the memo is like the commercial district wasn't really looked at because because of the way it's built.
It's
right?
pavement intensive.
It's very
Pavement-
pavement intensive and there
if
isn't
it's-
really
if it's- if-
anything you can do to make any significant change in the water,
Yeah.
stormwater runoff
Yeah,
in those districts.
When I walk by there every day, I look at those crumbling islands that separate, Southfield Road from the front parking lot, and it's like, why aren't those like green
I
space
want to rip
islands?
them all out and make
Exactly.
them green. I
Exactly.
really, truly do.
Yeah,
It's on 12 Mile, when when the DDA replaced the sidewalk, we usually narrowed the
I
sidewalk
saw that today.
and replaced the rest of it with
Dirt.
grass.
And grass.
Yeah. with more green. It might allow trees to be planted more effectively. Shade
Maybe,
trees.
Sure.
maybe, we'll
Yeah.
find the right trees that don't heat the sidewalks first.
Mhm.
And there are some that go
There are
down and
some.
step
Well,
out.
And from my,
Cypress.
from my classes that I've taken on, that in the past, it's a lot. Yeah, you need like 15 feet, I think, ideally. If I'm remembering correctly, an arborist would be able to tell you better for a shade tree, if you wanted a shade tree. To ensure that there's proper room and without it disrupting your sidewalks with major root stems, so.
I have an odd question. So what if, how does Scott, how does legally non-conforming fit into this? So let's say we put an ordinance in place and it's 35%. And I'm currently at 37% and I'm legally non-conforming, and now I have to pull a permit because my driveway is cracked, I gotta redo my driveway. Do I have to narrow my driveway? Or get rid of some pervious,
Some sort of pervious surface.
Space
Yeah, because
somewhere
if you-
else,
if
I mean,
you're-
how
if
would
you're
that work?
Modifying the property.
right?
It may come down to a percentage of the modification. How much of it impacts your overall impermeable surface, but. Yeah, that is another issue, and that was one of the concerns I had, and why I made the comment of maybe focusing on the commercial district. Might be more practical, because those are areas where redevelopment's more likely to occur than a residential setting.
Right. Yeah, and if
gonna
you
say-
do pull an outdoor permit, is gonna invoke that.
So say in a residential setting, I would imagine you would grandfather in material replacement as a repair or as a.
But as Bruce indicated, I mean, if you're gonna replace your whole driveway, you're now exceeding that threshold of what you can repair versus. It's now considered, you're starting over, you've got to.
I'm kind of looking at this and thinking of it in comparison to like your not in the community, but a lakefront cottage that is outside the bounds of what's permitted, but so long as you stay within your foundation, that same footprint, you're allowed to stay and do what you can where you're at within whatever restrictions they set. So I would tend to think of a driveway similarly, whether it's correct or not to do so, is that if your driveway is this size and you can put it back at this size, but you can't grow it because you've already exceeded what's allowable.
But
Yeah.
normally it's a percentage of, so if you're gonna replace 51% of your structure that was legally non-conforming, well, now you have to bring it all up to current standard.
Okay.
Right.
So what Bruce said is, if you're you're currently at 37% and your driveway constitutes, 18% of or 19% of that, well, then now you're over that 50%
Take,
threshold.
take out your patio and back,
Yeah.
or,
Or you're gonna have to put in a couple more rain barrels.
or,
So-
well, once again, yeah, getting into that, it gets into that fuzzy issue of how to, how do you employ something like that and have it really be meaningful? I mean, rather than just a token effort that might not be maintained or operated or,
Well, again, I think.
it's
the
like paying a
standards-
fee, an
standards for
extra fee
implementation,
to allow you to
you know,
exceed.
That I think that's gonna be key is how you control it, is
Yeah.
having those standards and having, we'll use the rain gardens, for example. I don't know if necessarily getting to the point of having, a flow rate calculation done by the city engineer, but at least a permit requirement that the building official has to go out and inspect them throughout the process, so.
For the installation.
Yeah, just
and-
instantly to ensure that, the people that are attempting, like Sue said, every little bit helps, right? But only if it's done properly.
Right, and rain gardens themselves step into that category of. Because I think we can find some examples in the neighborhood where they're probably obstructing visibility to the roads if they're not maintained or kept in a certain manner, as well as just the aesthetic appearance of them becoming overgrown versus manicured or maintained.
Right. Well, and I think for rain gardens, and I've kind of thought about this a little bit. I haven't really quite figured out the best mechanism to do it, but I think that I think maybe some sort of registration or permit, like a free thing, like, so we know that, like, hey, we know that, your property has a rain garden, and we can say, okay, have you done these maintenance things, as opposed to say, maybe Bo's got a rain garden. Yeah, I threw some hotkeys out there. Well, that doesn't constitute a rain garden, right? Like,
Right,
and so, Mark has one, I did mine too, and so, Mark's is registered, we know that he's got, these particular plants in there, these are the approved plants, and that's where the standards come in for these, and we can say,
Yeah.
and he's burned it once this year,
yeah, what, or,
but
look,
somehow
I
there's
think.
gotta be a way that we can.
I think more critical or as critical of that is that initial installation and what is that soil supposed to be? And are you taking out soils that are don't drain as freely as they might need to? And I'm not remembering the specifics of the soil base essentially that you're building beneath your rain garden
Like
to
our clay is
promote
not
that
good.
not
percentage
just
max.
the plants absorbing it and filtering it, but also that it does settle into the ground and not just become impermeable in
Right.
some regard and flow, or in the same token, or create an obstruction to the flow of the water.
Sure.
And it's interesting because you hear different things. I've heard about the flow supposedly needing to slow down. And I've heard about increasing the flow, but there's different information that sometimes floats out there as far as the proper intent and functioning. Slowing down the flow doesn't mean obstructing the flow necessarily.
Right.
So, yeah. So I would say a regulation on rain gardens or at least a strict guidelines for their installation that need to be adhered to, need to be really I defined. And then likewise, a means of the maintenance afterwards of it somehow being monitored, I would say would probably be a factor. They are work. It's not like you can just plant it and let it go. And I'm speaking more for my wife since she does a lot of it. It's her baby.
So. If. The question is really that council needs to figure out how they wanna deal with. Parking on roads, is it then better for council to come up with figure that question out before we come up with standards for that if we do? Or,
I think they can kind of work on both of them at the same time. I mean, I guess maybe the initial conversation with the council is. I think we want to do this, and then if so, which I think we should. Then. We can have the plan for changes.
And I think it's, well, whether it's a sale on, community beautification or maintenance of that. The aesthetic issues is part of it. It also has that infrastructure impact.
But I don't want to lose sight of what the issue that Bo brought up, which is like, where's the biggest impact? Right? Where should we be putting our energy based on things like what's the cost to the city of actually paying into these community sewage management systems like the Farmington one? So, I mean,
So-
how do we get that investigation going? How do we figure out like, what is it that we can do that will reduce our city's
How does-
overhead?
How
in
do
the
we
fall?
make that a priority to be like followed up on when it's, if it's not the purview of the planning commission, but it's an issue that's been flagged as a something that should be looked, I'm looking at Brisbane. I know it's like totally about infrastructure.
Right.
Or at least it's related to it. How do we conduct, how do we find out what the answer is, or how does the city, and once again, getting beyond planning commission. What's the purview for even having the discussion on it?
Is that something that like our SOQA liaison can bring up with SOQA? Is that a method to?
Do we have a,
Well,
do we
No,
have,
it's
a
not-
He's sitting right, he's sitting right back there.
Not SOCRA,
Not SOQA, well, it's Water Resource Commission, right?
like, bring it up.
WRC.
So, but there's no relationship between SOQA and WRC?
Minor, but
Yeah, 'cause
we have
soccer-
contacts with the water.
With
Resource
WRC,
Commission that
so
we
go that
can-
route, okay.
Jim Nash is.
Yeah,
yeah.
Well, and what we can do, I guess, in the interim is have Giffords work on that analysis too, because I think that's a really good point to understand exactly. I mean, we know that commercial district will be high, but
how big is that project, and are we talking about here, this is like an allocation that needs to come from city council as far as, how big of a study, if we're saying we want to understand what is the, is that, getting a few folks studying enough aerial photos of the entire community, that's probably where it fits in maybe most economically, but yeah, just the process of doing that is probably a project, and I don't know if that fits under the standard agreement between the city and Giffords Webster as far as their contract.
Probably a question for them to give us an estimate and then go from there.
Yeah.
Well, or maybe even,
Or
again, back to looking at the other communities. Why do these other communities that maybe have similar physical and population statistics to us have lower rates? What have they done? How does the system work to provide them with a lower sewage rate percentage of costs versus Lathrup? And then from that, maybe.
That's the engineering side of this.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, is there some secret sauce that Kego Harbor is doing because they're only paying 0.3% and we're paying 3%? What is it that Kego Harbor's doing, which is farther up the drain? They use more of the drain. Why is their rate only 3%? Do they have no runoff? What?
Right, what are the reasons?
Yeah.
Goes through ours.
I was really curious, I mean, just amongst the communities that are listed in the report, to see, for instance, maximum lot coverage is 30% in for single family in Birmingham. And I thought, really, what, it was hard for me to imagine that being the case with
Some of the houses
the
are like 50
large,
lots.
the large Bigfoot developments
Right.
that occurred, other than to think that they nipped that in the bud and they said, this is the criteria, now there's been a slowdown, but I haven't.
Or
been
those
walking-
houses are in different districts than the residential districts that are
I
mentioned.
mean,
in the
those,
report.
those.
Could be
like,
now.
I'm thinking of all the Bigfoot homes that I drive past, I take Brown Road in,
Yeah.
right? that's a lot of big foot homes, but I'm pretty sure that's more, I mean, it's not central business district, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say it's not R1A, R1 or
Right.
2 or 3.
Right, right. It's in a
Right.
different district. Yeah.
Right, well, it's still kind of interesting to me, yeah, 'cause I would have thought R1A, R1, 2, R3 would all be covered as like single family residential. I mean, getting beyond, is it townhouses that are interconnected, which is,
Well, and a lot of those Bigfoot houses, as I think about it, are actually a lot taller, kind
Yeah.
of to your lakefront, kind
Right,
of to your lakefront property, as long as you remain within this
The square, you
foundation.
go up, it's
you
fine.
know,
One wall.
but it speaks to that, the kind of the more old style urban approach where you're building closer to your lot lines, and then you've got your driveways in between. And
Right.
so you've got impermeable pavement as well as the impermeableness of
The house.
the house itself. Plus your outdoor structures in back, so
Right.
you can enjoy
Garage
the more of a postage stamp yard you might have.
Right.
And I'm probably being a little bit exaggerated there, but yeah, I just wondered. And it was easy for me to stop and think of, say, Southfield, for example, maximum lot coverage is 25%. And there's a lot of Southfield that has some larger lots, and I'm still sure that not everything necessarily applies or is necessarily meeting that in
Compliant.
existing conditions everywhere.
Yeah.
Especially in the smaller, close together homes, but once again, it just, that speaks to that variety and those conditions that are hard to regulate uniformly across multiple property or lot sizes. Now, we've talked a lot about this. Question is, can
it's
we
still like,
bring this into a,
I go back to why is this important? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? If we're trying to use this sort of an ordinance in order to help us with stormwater runoff, sure, that can help with things like the maintenance of the infrastructure that we've invested in and the water retention, the stormwater retention tanks and their maintenance and use, things like that. But if we're not getting any benefit in terms of the cost to the city of managing stormwater,
then there's another priority associated with why would we want to necessarily
the
restrict or limit the amount of permeable of impermeable surface,
surfaces, right?
which speaks to the aesthetic issue, providing more green, which should in theory help with the not just the appearance of the community, but also less hardscape, more green space.
Yeah, so if that's our priority, if that's what we're trying to accomplish, then maybe it makes sense to adopt something that limits.
I think that piece by itself makes sense to consider. But I think it's somewhat apart from how is this impacting, why do we pay so much? I think that's a separate issue that would be good to know when we talk about how much impermeable surface do we have. If we know that rate compared to surrounding communities, can it be pinpointed as this is the reason why we're paying more because we've got a higher percentage? At this point, I don't think we know that. It seems odd to me that it should be there would be that significant of a difference, speaking strictly of the residential. So I guess I don't have a full,
Well, so
it's good to know whether the study of that is going to provide valuable information to the city in general, as far as why if we're paying sewage rates that are higher than
So
or
what I-
stormwater rates. that are
Well, to
higher.
Bo's point, like, what is it, like 30% of the budget is spent on?
I don't know if it's 30. I
It's
think
a
it
lot,
was-
it's one of the biggest
yeah, I
water.
mean,
Yeah,
it's the
sewers.
single largest budget item.
Yeah. So that's the reason why you look at
Yeah.
that, but that's not our responsibility, right? But I think
No.
that the
No, the-
ask is to figure out some way through communication with the Water Resources Commission to come up with, understanding that better. right? That's-
Understanding it better, so, and that's a city issue, it's not necessarily a planning issue unless the solution starts to involve planning related issues.
But maybe we take up this sort of an ordinance just for the reasons you were saying, that it helps with greenery and beautification, the aesthetics. right?
Right. And I think that's a consideration. I think it'll possibly be enhanced or informed what, what that might be if we can get more information. I'm not trying to say we need to hold it up, because I think it's
Do it in
it's a
parallel.
valid goal from a planning standpoint in terms of the greening of the community as opposed to the paving of the community.
Agreed. Yeah.
So,
I think that's an appropriate path forward, that, we can talk to the city engineer, just get more information from an engineering standpoint. I'm hearing a lot of concern regarding that here. And so since that wasn't really discussed, intently, then we can have that conversation and provide more information if we are able to obtain more, from an engineering standpoint. But just to circle back to the planning standpoint, which we initially started discussing, was how to apply certain percentage standards, whether it's a blanket percentage or a scaled percentage. It sounds like the interest is more in scaled, so that it can account for smaller lots versus larger lots. And so when we do get more information from speaking from an engineering standpoint, how we can apply, the certain percentage from a scaled standpoint.
yeah, do we have more, is there more information from these communities on how they address it, or is it are we to interpret that this is just the blanket rate that applies to everything? There's not a variegated scale based on property size.
We don't know, right?
Yeah,
So
we
they're
don't
asking the
know.
question.
Yeah,
So
we-
please
yeah,
find
the-
out.
The question is, what can you tell us? What can you find out? And provide to us as far as how other communities are regulating variation, and are they? Maybe that gets into just a can of complexity that, we may want to dive into, considering we're a smaller community, or we may just say, okay, this range, without
Make it simple.
splintering it into too many different, or maybe there's a formula.
Simple is gonna be better just because it's easier to enforce. I mean,
Yes,
that's-
yeah, right. Interpret and enforce. Rule of thumb is generally better than having to do calculations. Detailed calculations to make a determination, so. So mostly that's feedback at this point. Let's say that we have anything to act on or provide a motion on.
I don't think so.
No.
We'll keep chatting.
So that's just an ongoing business for future discussion. So then we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the schedule of amendments and commissioner priorities.
So I think that's a good segue into this section, in the sense that we have the generators discussion, which is, a priority, but it's one that maybe it'll be more easy to implement and make changes to, versus what we just discussed with the impervious coverage discussion. That is a little bit more challenging, time consuming. So Jill put together a diagram that kind of outlines the priorities that the city would have, the planning commission would have, and the amount of effort that would go into those. So
From Giffords Webster's
Perspective.
understanding and perspective.
that's right. Yes, sir. And so that, in addition to the survey that I believe you all had provided information and feedback on, the results of that, I was doing some analysis prior to the meeting today, and it appears as though some of the lower priorities would be updating the home occupation standards, updating the lighting standards, and updating bicycle parking standards. So while those are all items that can be addressed and discussed, and be happy to hear feedback from you, those were among the lower priorities on the survey's response.
Can I interrupt?
Planning Commission? Yes,
I'd like to, are we saying that the results of the initial survey of the commission are in alignment with this, or counter to this, or somewhere in between?
You're referring to the diagram?
Yeah, to the diagram.
I-
In terms of prioritization, are the perspectives aligning or, I think
agree with you.
we're all
Yes.
coming from our own point of view in terms of, and maybe that's based on, geez, how important is this? And we don't really know because we need more information. So it's somewhat of a random, I mean, I felt that way as far as filling out the survey.
Yeah.
So, as part of the response, just,
Well, and I think that's all up for discussion. Like I said, those were the lower rated items. And then the ones that were of most interest were to update the stormwater management, the low impact development standards, which we just had a good conversation on. Review and update the standards for blight and nuisances, update landscaping standards, provisions for solar energy. And then the updates to the CV district standards. So I think while there's a lot of parallels to the matrix, I think it's still on the table as to what the planning commission feels is the most important, the highest priorities. And we can just kind of gauge, like we had done with the generator discussion, how that's more of an easy implementation, high priority. But then some of these other items, like the impervious coverage and whatnot, are more of a time consuming, high effort, so to speak, process. So we're open to hearing what the commission has in regards to those. But I think that's all on the table as of right now.
so it's a lot of items, I guess, on this page in front of us. I'm referring to page 19.
I'm assuming we'll get an updated one with this once you collect all that information. and-
Yeah, we can do that. for
But it'd
sure.
be a different one, right? Because this grid is based on the audit. And what we're saying is it'd be nice to have a similar graph,
So
like
maybe it's a
easy way to
parallel
view
one.
the result of our survey,
Yeah,
which might be different. Then we can compare what the audit came up with compared to what
Yeah.
the commissioners feel is the priorities.
Still trying to figure out how the audit came up with update bicycle parking as a high priority.
yeah, I mean, I would say that same thing. I was
That
just
seems like a
okay.
low priority to me, but yeah.
Right, yeah, similarly, when I read about, what was it, review housing option, housing occupation, home occupation standards. And I wasn't sure exactly what that was trying to address, or I mean, what that meant.
I'm guessing, I thought that meant, like Airbnbs and things like that.
Okay.
Rental.
Rental
So
status
if you look at
versus,
page 21.
Yeah, it's on there.
There's a section on residential districts. And
the aging in place.
no, above that, the
Right,
previous page,
Right,
has the section on home occupations.
okay,
So it says, consider updating standards in section 4.11 that regulate home-based businesses. Remove prohibition of display shelves. So it's like trying to make it easier for somebody to run a home-based business.
I think Bill spoke to this based on our recent experience going through COVID and the fact that, I mean, early in COVID, there was a period where I put forth for my own business, the company I work for. I said, oh, we should have, our own, post our own sign. This is now the, Lathrup Village office, because we were all,
Yeah,
our private offices interconnected with our respective employers. Just as a, I don't know, kind of a spirit builder back in the earlier days of COVID, but yeah, I think there was that recognition because of COVID and that people working from home had taken on a different light in terms of how zoning, what zoning restrictions existed in the past. So there's probably something that needs to be looked at there.
so I think, yeah, something like that, to me, it's low effort, right? Because it's really just like removing some restrictions that make it potentially difficult to operate a home business as a private employee of a
Right.
private company in
I
your house.
would agree with that to some
And it's a high
degree.
priority because a lot of people are doing it now.
Yeah, it becomes, it's not free reign to have delivery trucks. I mean,
Come into your house.
although we do have delivery trucks coming, but yeah, not,
Not every week,
not in our driveways and dropping off equipment yeah, materials that are being moved in and out.
the way you would if you
in a-
had like
in from
a,
a business
retail
standpoint,
business or
yeah, the
something like
retail
that.
business, Right. You're not
We're
conducting
not talking
sales,
about the Amazon truck.
right? I'd say we're all seeing more trucks visit our houses, but yeah. I mean, it's just the way of acquiring goods is happening more in that fashion, but yeah, it's a different topic.
Eric, I thought it was a little confusing having sort of three groupings of items. The grid, the quadrant grid, I don't know, the list of, what you would call
The
this.
table of,
The checkup, the zoning health checkup, and then the zoning priority to kind of overlay which was which. In doing it, reading through the zoning health checkup, there were a number of things that seemed to me were, we'll call them bookkeeping or, easy to do. Yeah, let's change the comma to a semicolon or whatever. And to lump those in with, well, okay, we don't really want to do anything on bicycle parking, just as a for instance. So I don't know if there's a way you can kind of consolidate these into one element. Or even maybe distill them back so that it's easy to say, yes, we want to do this. And then, I don't know, does that make sense? You follow what
You're
I'm
saying like, you're trying to say like, what are more administrative tasks?
Yeah, there were seemed to be some
opposed to-
admitted things that we could kind of knock off, yes. But then some other things that we want to take some time to contemplate, think about.
Right, I understand that from the standpoint of organization, so you can just knock off,
Yeah,
once again, easy items on the list
and
that are like housekeeping sort of
Exactly.
issues.
yeah. And if we can, and it takes, again, back to taking a half hour to agree to them, they're done. Yes, and then we can, they don't hang out there and we don't get tripped up by them by somebody who notices that the temporary structure doesn't include the yurt. And, we need to put the yurt in there as
right,
a definition, right?
How long-
Which is a real life one that I had run into once in a prior life.
is a yurt a house?
Temporary structure that became permanent and whatever.
Uh-huh,
It's a round
Yeah.
building from Tibet, I think. or
that's right,
somewhere.
Yeah.
yes.
Never stayed in one.
So I don't know if my fellow council people.
Yeah, we can
Commissioners.
work on that, yeah.
I agree, yeah, no, it's hard to, I don't know, kind of figure out like how
Yeah.
all these things kind of fit together, the way they're presented. right?
The quadrant was nice because it did, but then there wasn't enough to it,
Not enough detail, yeah.
right?
To-
And then
to
it didn't
understand what it was-
exactly match up with the items below. And
Like
then the survey, whatever, I think, follow what I'm saying.
He gets it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like things like the bicycle parking, right? In the table on page
19,
27.
Oh.
The table, not the grid, the table, right? Page 27 under chapter 5 site standards, right? So bicycle parking is listed on here. Says consider adding bicycle parking standards credit for vehicle parking. It's a question. I don't know what that means.
I would understand that is if you provide bicycle parking, can you reduce your
The number of vehicles,
automotive parking? Yeah,
if you're a business.
if you're a business.
So this is a site standard that's only applicable to businesses. I'm like, why is this important? Like
Greening of the community would, be a plus, but
Okay.
Presuming your parking, isn't restricting your business, and creating an off-street parking. or
Especially given all the
off-site
problems that
parking.
we have with parking in the city because we don't have enough places to put parking.
Well, once again, based on zoning.
Right.
Based on zoning.
Right,
So
right.
But not necessarily based on
Actual need.
actual need,
You're
I
right.
would say.
Yeah, we can provide a revised table in the next discussion and try and clarify some of those points that you bring up.
Yeah, some way to get that level of
Maybe a
detail.
column that shows where it fell on zoning priority survey.
On the survey, sure,
You
okay.
know, a column that says landscaping based on the 7 inputs was a medium, you know, a 3.2 on the priority scale.
Okay.
That's another interesting one on development review. Consider allowing small, less than 10% additions to non-conforming structures as long as not increasing non-conformities. I just,
Yeah. It's hard to,
it sounds like
Contradictory.
contradictory there. Like, aren't you, let's allow 10% increase to a non-conforming structure as long as it's not, it doesn't increase, isn't it increasing the non-conformities? I don't know what that means.
Which one is that? Which?
This
page?
is on page
Page
28. Under non-conformities. It's related to chapter 6.
it's the way I interpret that is something like what we were talking about with the lakeside house, right? So if it's a non-conforming structure, but you're adding another level to it, it's not necessarily increasing the non-conforming footprint.
As long as you don't exceed the height, yeah.
As long
The
as you
height
don't exceed
limitation,
the height
yeah,
limitation
right.
in the city, right, in the
Right.
city ordinance, the zoning ordinance.
Something to be-
But I don't know, it's just an assumption I'm making, I really don't know.
In part, I feel like there's just a lot of information to try to like, okay, how do we work our way through this to make the choices on where we're digging in on the information that's provided here. And I think is the goal today to look at the quadrant on page 19 and say yay or nay, we agree with where this is, or that's in part of what we think we just did with the survey. And so is the next step to incorporate what's in the survey and then, or look at the survey compared to this and say, hey, this, our perception is different than Giffords-Webster's perception on this, and then reconcile it.
I think that's kind of what Bo was
Yeah,
getting at.
yeah, and then trying to get more maybe it means more background information on which we're starting to dabble into here with the subsequent pages as to just trying to grasp at, what does this mean? If, for instance, if I pick on just one that's, update CV district standards, is there a reason that's driving that? Is that something that's not part of the master plan, updating the master plan effort? When I see the update standards, update to the, is there something driving what those standards are, or that we should be looking at making adjustments to them? Is something falling behind a current trend? Is it something that is like, this is our goal, or this is what we hope for the community, and it's not aligning with it? We need to make modifications to it. Yeah, I'm starting to just wonder if some of this has overlap with the changes to the master plan.
Well, like you just brought up like the commercial vehicular district, like look
Yeah.
at that, right? That's in the grid. If you look in the table on page 23, under office, commercial, industrial districts, the first item in there, in that part of the table is about this.
Yeah.
And it says, consider whether it's consistent to allow bars and taverns as permitted uses, but have establishments involving the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages be special land use. It's like, so it's, and I'm not sure what drove that. Like where in the audit is that that concept coming from?
Yeah, is that yeah, that count? I mean, I would.
Is that something that we discussed in the past and I maybe don't
Well,
remember?
I mean, even in that opening paragraph, I mean, everything that's in normal font and normal typeface are things that have essentially been on your list of to-dos, implementation to-do since the 2016 master plan update. right? Everything that is, everything that we've talked about, is in bold, and then if it's bold and underlined, I mean, that was something that was brought up additionally, right? So, I mean, for that particular one, I have to imagine that this is, okay, this is something that you guys talked about back in 2016 or earlier. And just has not been part of your, not.
I
taken up
was
on
gonna
your cities.
say, like, you making reference to the bold, so I'm going to Village Center District. And the city should establish a street light fixture and other street furnishings. This could be included in the sub area plan. I remember having previous discussions or the suggestion of that, so it's been jotted down as something that we should look at. Even while we, I mean, I suppose establishing those standards would allow us to have them ready for when the development that we envision, comes to
Right.
fruition, or at least so we can implement it in part.
Well, and we've talked about that one, I mean, specifically that one with the Panera PUD, right?
Right,
Like,
we
oh,
did. It was an
But, I mean,
aspect,
like,
what,
that's-
what is our standard so
what's our
that we,
standard, right?
well,
So,
yeah,
I mean, I look at the chart, it's kind of like the snapshot, and then this is obviously the detail. That kind of, all right, well, so what do we want to do? Right?
Yeah.
That's how I've been looking at this chart, is saying,
right.
okay, which ones do we want to knock out first, and then, right, what does that mean?
Right,
Let's go back over
I
there.
think part of that effort is trying to get items to the wayside that are low, which I think is what Gibble Webster's is pushing towards. Let's review this list, get some of these items identified as priorities, and then start working on them before we get, interrupted,
Okay.
or that effort gets interrupted by the next development project that
Projects.
comes before us, or community, element that comes before us. Which I don't disagree with.
So I just want to call attention that I just noticed in page 28, under development review section, the second item is special land uses, and it says consider allowing the final decision to rest with the planning commission for special land uses. So I'm guessing at some point in the past, somebody brought up the idea that, hey, maybe the planning commission should be the body that recommends approval of special land uses, not the city council.
I never remember that being discussed in this commission before,
I don't remember it being discussed as long as I've been on this commission.
so
I mean, all the way the charter is written, it would have to be approved by the city council anyway, legally, right? So it's, and they can always
to relinquish
not do
the
what we recommend.
responsibility.
I don't even think that's possible. I don't think the charter would actually allow that to happen.
I mean, I'm not sure where Joe came up with that idea, but.
I don't know, if we go based my thought process earlier, and all the regular typeface as well before my time, so.
I'm just, something like that, I'm like, maybe we just,
Oh, I can tell you
Dump that.
historically, I think we tried to take some of the responsibility away from the planning commission, not give back to it. I mean, there was, at one point, the city council took back the capital improvement plan.
Right.
And there were a couple other things that planning commission had the ability to just take it away, so. I'm not sure if we talked about that historically. I don't know.
No, I don't, because I remember it coming to the planning commission, but I don't remember it ever having been taken away, so that's at least 10 years ago.
Well, the site plan approval was one thing that was previously held by city council. It was given appropriately given to the planning.
Yeah.
commissions.
Right.
But
Really upon the founding
I
of the
don't ever
planning
recall
commission.
especially in this being. And then.
yeah, it doesn't make sense to me that we would have that responsibility. Like the city council has lots of other components of what they do that impact that decision, that planning commission does not have responsibility for. So when it
So
comes to things like special.
we've had some long discussions. Does the commission feel we need more time to review these lists to prioritize, or are we set to like kind of churn through these right now and say yay or nay on prioritization, or is this something that should be done in a
Special meeting. or
in a
something, right?
special meeting or a
You guys want to
Well,
workshop?
I-
workshop meeting where you go and put dots on a page after you have a chance to look at and say, this is my top priority, or what seems like a top priority. But I think it needs to really be accompanied by some discussion, so
Yeah.
that there's a perspective on you know, you might have a reason why you select a particular topic, and it might be of particular importance or interest to any individual here.
Then we can
But there
debate.
might be some perspective from Giffords Webster that says this is why we think this should be a priority. And those things get hashed out so that that prioritization can really take place. And
I feel like, Bo's suggestion that like we just kind of get some more easier to consume information about what's in the grid with the prioritization as well as.
Yeah, maybe add columns to the grid that include how we rated it. And then which line item that we, on the survey, we related to is that item. And then where you initially said high priority, easy, difficult, maybe, and put it all on one. So 3 new columns on the blue, green, red chart, where each item falls into the survey and or the grid.
So I think if
that
we
we
can get
can-
that, we can get that information and have some time to review it and then do a workshop
Yeah.
where we can
Yeah.
debate these
Yeah.
things. And then we can bring it back into the planning commission to actually formally
Mhm.
approve our prioritization. That seems to me like an appropriate process on how to
Yeah.
do this. And I know it'll take more time, but I think it's important that we do it that way. My
Yeah.
opinion.
yeah, I think it needs that hashing out.
And I don't know if something was identified 6 years ago and it's never been touched since.
Things
We
have
dump it.
changed. Is it any longer a priority?
That's how I feel about the
we've-
special land
there's a
use
lot
one,
of
like,
new
it's
people-
done. Like, let's just dump that off this table altogether.
Much of the
right?
commission, yeah, when you say back to 2016,
I wasn't here.
it's, yeah, it's not even Bruce, so it's me, it's Scott, who's not on the commission.
That's it.
Yeah,
That's
that's
you.
it. It's me. So
Very.
I'm wondering,
I cast a vote in my head on everything.
keep points or something.
All right, so workshop, revised
So,
workshop it is.
Does the committee want to set up a workshop date to have this occur? I mean, this would be the
Webster's gonna
step.
need some time to put together the
Yeah.
additional data and the
Okay.
way
Yeah.
that Bo was just suggesting they kind of format it. So
And then we can doodle it.
let's do that. Let's get the data and then let's do a doodle to figure out when we can do the workshop.
So we'll coordinate with Susie and as we make progress.
I think that's the
Right,
best way to do it.
yeah, and if there's, questions that come from when, and I presume Jill will be involved to some degree with this process as well. If she's like scratching her head as to what did they discuss and what was the point, and there needs to be interaction, there might need to be that between, surveying the commission just to provide some guidance in the interim before they provide that feedback.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
Yeah,
We can do that via email or whatever.
Oh,
or
we know how to find
Forum.
that.
True. Right.
so. All right. So I think we have guidance on next steps for that. Nothing under new business. Anything under matters for discussion?
I have one other matter for discussion. Mark, I just want to thank you for your leadership and you've been a fantastic chair for this commission, and we are going to be struggling to replace your wisdom and your expertise and skill. And you've just been so level-headed and supportive, and I'm just grateful that you were willing to do this job for as long as you were willing to do it. So thank you for
Well,
all.
thank you. Thank you for the support, because I think it's a difficult, it's, I don't know, my perspective is sometimes difficult to step out from the, I like to get my hands into what's in the plan reviews and whatnot, and I still do. But at the same time, I try to encourage to get that feedback going from the rest of the commission. And I think that's part of the role that, in the way I tried to embrace it through the years that I've been doing that.
You did it
So-
great. You really did.
So, and as well as hopefully helping people out get adapted to it. And it's really a much looser, conversational style. I was always very early on nervous that things are so rigid. What are the rules and how do you follow them? But I don't know that we necessarily get business conducted, or we feel we can speak freely. So I've tried to at least allow, it to be a looser atmosphere so that can take place. And so, you're not feeling like you don't know whether it's appropriate to say or what the conversation needs to occur. And this is the opportunity for it to occur. Sometimes it's a little nervous being on stage and on cameras about that because, you're frankly, you're trying to put your thoughts together and decide, what to say. And sometimes you're also guarding that you don't want to say, something too flip or something like that, because, really you're trying to come through that thought process of, how do we get there? How do we get to where we're going? And sometimes that means going some places that you might not necessarily want to be or feel comfortable being public about. So
Right.
I don't know, that's just some of the thoughts I've had over my tenure with the planning commission. So
Well, thanks.
and also why I kind of put it out there, well, if anybody feels that they need to reach out to, for input or guidance or thoughts. And when I say that, I'm thinking more of my technical background as an architect and the ability to dig into drawings and plans and thinking about things that have, occurred through what I've, experienced in my career that lends to that. But also any experiences with how do we deal with potentially difficult situations or tense, issues before the community in general, where there's heated opinions about things. So those are certainly fun to address, but
Yeah, well, thanks. And I don't know if you saw last night, we did pass a resolution in your honor. I don't know if you saw the
No, I
council
didn't.
meeting, so
Yeah.
you'll. Oh, well, sorry.
stealing.
I didn't.
Thunder
Stealing?
Stealer.
Just kidding.
Wrong. They didn't pass a resolution. They passed a proclamation.
Proclamation.
Thank you for all of your many years of service.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And watch the meeting, because we all said really nice things.
I'll have to, yeah. Well, thanks. Sorry, I'm not prepared for a speech here beyond what I just said, but I really appreciate that recognition. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, we appreciate you and we're glad to have you and have had you on your service. And
Thanks.
hope you keep popping in planning commission meetings. From
Yeah, please. show up
Yeah,
to
it's a
thank
it's a chance to
Keep us
harass,
honest, keep us
provide,
honest.
talk about things. I should do that. That's a thought. Okay. I guess without being at a loss, loss of words, I'll just move on to, is there any general communication or is this part of the, is this part of that general communication?
Well, I'll just say we have a infrastructure meeting tomorrow at 6:30 downstairs in the community
AM?
room. Yeah. Do you know me? That'll never happen. Yeah, 6:30 PM
PM.
downstairs in the community room. So all are attended to.
Oh, invited.
All are
Okay.
invited to attend.
Anything from legal? No, no dates from, okay. We have,
Motion
Motion
to
to
adjourn this
adjourn.
meeting.
Second.
all in favor?
Yep.
I need a vote.
Meeting adjourned.